Good morning, Gen Rinpoche. Tashi Dale. Thank you for these precious teachings. And good morning, Katrina. Thank you for translating for us today. And welcome to everyone online. We're happy that you can join us. And we'll begin with some preliminary prayers. The link for the prayers is in the chat box.
To the teacher endowed, transcendent destroyer, one thus gone, foe destroyer, completely and fully awakened one, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, one gone to bliss, nor of the world supreme guide of beings to be tamed. Teacher of gods and humans, to you the Buddha endowed, transcendent destroyer, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When, O supreme among humans, you were born on this earth, you paced 7 strides and said, I am supreme in this world. To you who are wise, then I bow. With pure bodies formed supremely fine, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain. Fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best supreme guide, to you I bow. With the supreme signs, face like a spotless moon, color like gold, to you I bow. You are immaculate, the 3 worlds are not, incomparable wise one, to you I bow. Great compassionate protector, all-knowing teacher, field of merit and good qualities, vast as an ocean, to the Tathagata I bow. Through purity, freeing from attachment, through virtue, freeing from the lower realms. Unique, supreme, ultimate reality, to the Dharma that is peace I bow. Having freed themselves, showing the path to freedom too, well established in the trainings. The holy field endowed with good qualities, to the Sangha I bow. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions. Subdue your mind completely, this is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a mirage, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew, a bubble. A dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through this merit may sentient beings attain the state of all-seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from the ocean of cyclic existence, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. This ground anointed with perfume, flowers strewn Mount Meru, 4 lands, sun and moon. Imagined as a Buddha land and offered to you, may all beings enjoy this pure land. Venerable holy gurus, in the space of your truth body, from billowing clouds of your wisdom and love, let fall the rain of the profound and extensive Dharma, in whatever form is suitable for subduing sentient beings. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings. I take refuge until I have awakened in the Buddhas, the Dharma, and the Sangha. By the merit I create, by listening to the Dharma, I will attain Buddhahood in order to benefit all sentient beings.
Dikson
Oh, yeah.
ya, George Panda Adishak, Song Lerwa, Lamduna Songudwa, Nicholsera. Koya Della captures. Koya Della captures. Tikbe Lela and Dotani, Kanshi Ranshi Samtoni, Gibutoni and Jinshi Chas. Tikarsongusana. Koya Della captures, Nazukasi, Gibuchungu de Shera, Gibuchungu in a koya, Tewatandu Nigdwa, Joashima Lata Mi, Kovanchi Tona, some Titandu Yamato, Koya Letandu Taras, some look at Koki Omara. That and the Kibu drink up so. Lada Mila, Lada Yumubo, Lada Mila Kena, Tia to Major Shijeresha Asamne, Koa Koya Kora, Nesun Sumta Mayba, Lada Mida, Pamayela Soba, Lada Yumubo, and the Kiwasila Shijetela, Tetungi Ranshin Lumato Madeva Resha Asamne, or Teletungi Ranshin to Tone, and Koya Della captures. Lada Mi Kajinda Samba, La Sobarwa. Koyatene Dunkam Lada Sungam Yala Soba, Pisum Soba Kandichi Yuna, Tesu Samalako, Laniji Shawaja, Tungaji Ranshin to Tone, and Junesha la Satamana, she said. Juba Junke Michine Kokala, and Coach Jubel Jumila with what the Sunday Kigmarwa, or Tina Shiko Tongi Ordo, the Koyate like captures. Marazune Koyate all young Barchone. Ti Tangdulane Teleshin Jachigora. They keep on drinking Koya to me some time. Koya de Wadela Pakabdixon, Shimbalon, Sigara. Sem de Tea woman do some Shibalon. Koya de la capture sins. Tigbele and daughter, yes. Koya de la capture sins the Kulon to Tangiora. Koya to Mele Tanduye. Kulon to Tangiora. Tigbele and daughter, yes. Tigbele, Tikba Migiwa. Chula Soba, Sogiora. Tatia, Tiwachanja, Mikio Chanjal Kujumere. Kunjun Demba Samal Kosore. When a Yamogo Gisabe, Kivele Regina, Tiako, Kunju Temetan Dugora, or Tindico. Yamokanga Samitangora, Mikio at some Maimba, Yamotamje, Tigbele, Tigbele, Danis, that's all that the words of tender. Tigba Mikio ala Soba. Tedale Tobe Tangishangi. And then the Kenyipa Tomba Inadra, Kizupa Tomba Inadra, Kelompa Tomba Inadra, oh, Ticoe Tenetungele, Dog Coe Chu, Mikiwa Yamole, Dogbar Shibe, Tani changes, Choa the Tengdoa, Namba Sanjay Bene, Kamruchi Inadra, Kenyi Tombala Nadra. Kizu Pamarina, Kelon Pamarina, Sanga Tombala Tomba Unico, Tilian Dogbe Tani Cheredora, Tichora di Tengdoa, Tarbatue Choatelia, and Sota reading la sopa, Tombaya Lane, Ti Toba Sigurdo, Tigbele and Do, Tanise, and Tigbele and Do, Tanicenti, and Tikasura. Sota reading de la Sigura. Tigbele and Do Tanishi, Choa de Sigura. Kanshi Ranshi Samtoni, and Jebu the Gariton de Nigorasana, Rani, Shotarba Topna Samton de Nigora. Gengo Sutanatela Kanshi Ranshi Samtoniste, Nyande Lamla Shungeta, Range Lamla Shungeta, or Tesula Sungora. Chidako Tarba Top de Kansayana, Nera Lamla Shuku Vengeva Yomara, Tebachimbe Lamla Lochane, and Karsore, Koete Vale, Tante Tarba Top de Loyora. Ina Tantan Delia, Kibun Dringis, Kibu Chambose, take up. Drink the one still a channel, Yora. Kibele and Dotani. Kanshi Ranshi Samtani, Kibutene, Tamarshis, Kibuchungo Koetewa, Tondanya, the Lecho to Cuba. Rava. 기부 첨부 심지어 탐제가 더 산제지 고반 토바데 기부 첨부래 멤버 소산 링이셔라 코에 대화 좀 되는 얘기들 하고 코에 대화를 탄데 어 아니 심지어 탐제가 더 코에 동엘에 대화하고 삼삼삼으로도 요 말하단다 걔네들 기부 첨부 기부 첨부 삼로 심지어 탐제 코에 동에 토달을 대화를 차원냐 별로래 멤버 소산에 링이셔 어 기부되는 정시샤스 대치라나 또 스마 도체서 야
So here to begin with a quotation from Joel Atisha from his Lamp for the Path. He says, "Those who seek peace for themselves alone, turning away from worldly pleasures and avoiding destructive actions, are said to be of middling capacity." So here, this really, in the Tibetan, it begins with this line of turning away from samsara's pleasures. So turning their back on the various pleasures of samsara is really the kind of goal of this particular type of being. And last time we had talked about the being of small scope who seeks out rebirth as a human or a god. But for this being, a being of middling capacity, they see that such a rebirth, even as a human or a god, is not beyond the nature of suffering. It's not just the three lower realms that are really in that suffering nature, but even if one is to take rebirth as a human or a god, you haven't passed beyond the kinds of sufferings of samsara. And so seeing that suffering nature, that even if one were, say, born as like a desire realm god, like Brahma or Indra, that they are still subject to samsara's sufferings, being under the control of contaminated actions and the afflictions. And so they come to see in the way, like if you were to present a really beautiful meal to someone who is nauseated, who is sick and vomiting, they wouldn't have any desire for that food. So too, this being sees the pleasures of samsara as being like that. They just see it all as being in the nature of suffering. And so unlike that, we are normally attached to the pleasures of this life. We strive after them, we crave for them. But this type of being averts that sort of craving. And that in the first line then describes that they're turning their back or turning away from worldly pleasures. And the way that they apply themselves to that, or the kind of training that they therefore engage in, is talking about, well, they avoid destructive actions. So avoiding destructive actions. So the first line really tells the motivation. We see that all of samsara is in the nature of suffering. And then the way to get out of that is by taking up a kind of ethical conduct, the ethics of abandoning the 10 non-virtues, but not just negative actions. They see that any sort of actions motivated by our afflictions are part of the source of suffering. All of our afflictions are going to lead to further samsaric rebirth. And therefore, it's not just the kind of negative actions that one wants to get rid of, but even the afflictions that motivate one to engage in those actions. So one might take vows of, say, a householder, or vows of ordination, various types of vows, but one applies oneself to these kinds of methods to be able to get rid of the various kinds of afflictions, to reverse the causes that lead us to take rebirth in samsara. And so one who enters the path, one might enter into the hearer's vehicle, or maybe from the beginning is entering into the Mahayana. But as it describes here, this is a being of middling capacity in the sense that they are superior. Their kind of intention is superior to those of beings of small scope who are still striving for samsaric rebirth, even if they are in the higher realms. But they aren't yet to the capacity of the Mahayana, wherein they are acting for the sake of all sentient beings, striving to be able to bring about that state of enlightenment for all sentient beings. So this kind of being is of middling capacity in the sense that they are applying themselves toward gaining a state of liberation for themselves alone, based upon seeing the suffering nature of samsara and applying themselves to then eliminating destructive actions and emotions.
야. 어디인데 기부 총회 값이나 아니 교와 치마 신이 교와 치마 들려 돈돌라 소바 냐와라 소바 근데 교와 냠발라나 동해지랑 시체레 삼 델렌지시 트라네네 라다 메고와 탑도 했던 얘기도 와 다단데 기분 되게 값어 되네 냐와에다 돈도 참 많이 봐 Lada me lama ila soba, doa redu kanto kia na tungaji rashi chanda tongyora. O di indi, kuya tela capture shin se, digi di tengdwa, kuya tela capture shis. Kuya tewa pusum soba condition na tela capture shis, tungaji bati tengyora. Lada me kia wala soba, pusum soba kia condition na, diko ya ure mendu samdi tungaji bati tengyora. Kuya tela capture shis. Tikbele la doa danyi sidi, koa korchi ki kuyu sowa kare sidi, ngeson la kechi tila tikba mikiwa. Rawa, lada mili kechi tila, mikiwa mene kiwa yina ya, nyomo gwa ki kiwe le soba tila tini kiwa ra. Tik kunju tenpa tegitwa. Tikbele la sidi, tikba tila mikiwa ta, nyomo tsama yungitwa. So kunju tenpa tegiwa ra, tikbele la doa si. Tanyi sidi dogbe tanyi chenji, Sota redun la sokpe tomba laane, te ten la labo sumje, nyamle chagwa ra, sutubje laba, tengaje laba, shirabje laba nyamle chidu, ko lamde de tengdwa, tomba ni tobe shirab la soba, o de lamde de tengwa ra, tanyi sede, tikpe lele dogbe, tanyi chenji sede, o tikpe lele dogbe. Gangshi rangshi samto nyesde ten gwauten di tengdwa tarba, gogbe tenba, koye tongwele tarba gwauten di tengdwa. Ho ten di kibun rengi kapsu, tenba shi kone, tongwe tenba da kunju tenba kone kwa kursu, rawa lamden da gwauten ki kone, ane namsa soki tarba tupsu, ane tenre yala chungni ki kone, kwa kursu, rawa, ane tela tene paane, dosu tenre yala chungni ta tenba shi namsa chasandi kibun rengi kapsu shegi wara. Oya tichi kyuna ha.
Mhm. So the being of small scope, they see that taking a rebirth as, say, an animal or a hell being, those kinds of lower rebirths are in the nature of suffering, and therefore they want to avoid that by engaging in virtuous actions that will lead to a higher rebirth. When you get to the being of middling capacity, they see that no matter where you take rebirth, even as a human or a god, whatever of the 6 types of beings one is born as, this is in the nature of suffering. And so whatever sort of excellent things within samsara, they come to recognize that these are in the nature of suffering. So this really, where it says the line, and this English translation, turning away from worldly pleasures, really teaches the truth of suffering, recognizing that even a good rebirth is subject to the sufferings of samsara, being compelled by contaminated actions and our destructive, afflictive emotions. And so for a being of middling capacity, they don't just avoid those kinds of non-virtuous actions that would lead to a lower rebirth, but even those virtuous actions, whatever is motivated by our ignorance and afflictions, is going to lead to a renewed birth within samsara. So where it says, and avoiding destructive actions, now here it's hard to capture every word of the Tibetan in the English, but really this is referring to the source of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering. And based upon that understanding that it is our afflictive emotions and the karma that they drive that leads to this renewed rebirth, one wants to avoid that. And so here, where it talks about sort of, and I'm trying, hard to find the exact word, but the one that is in this sort of nature, the nature of their practice is to avoid those negative actions. And so this is really teaching the truth of the path, in that one takes up various vows, the vows of individual liberation and so forth, and based upon that, then engages in the various trainings, the paths that will lead to freedom from this. So taking up the training in ethical conduct and meditative concentration and wisdom, this is then the truth of the path. And then finally, where it says then, those who seek peace for themselves alone. So seeking peace is teaching that truth of cessation. So here, for a being of middling capacity, the emphasis is on teaching these four noble truths, how it is that we engage in samsara, the various ways in which we are in that kind of negative cycle. And then there is the sort of non-afflicted, the purified side of that, how we get out of that. So this being a middling scope thoroughly understands the four noble truths, so the 12 links of dependent origination, and based upon that understanding, then pursues how to get out of this cycle of samsara.
Oh yeah. Oh, that is. Oh, the Nikasura. 기부충의 값이나 사담이 기와디고 톱자 터두레 지기도 내급테나 고틸레 라버지 톱자케 삼로 고고요 말아. 얘네 기분 된다 첨부 값이 사담이 기와딜레 톱자 송고요 말아 레니 요하게 기와랑 고틸레 역전도 타는 동해기랑 신통고요라. 이나티 고고요라 타바 마토바도 리데데 최주베 땐도 티고고요라. 티 톱자 타두세 티 야고레 something that give chung na she some go marita in a lot of me go back to go Migi wa chu ba ke wa chu tu ba le tene ten sang bo che tu be lu tin che bar che ma bo chi ke wa ne ke wa chu di tom ne ne te ten do ne tar wa da tham je che be ko ba tum di sam lu to go ra sa ko ten je tom che ha ra chi ten de sam go marita in a lot of me ke wa chu di tom ne ti ten de pe chu che che ne tarwada 탐지 쳔바 톱지 락정이 와라 어디질람나 야
So, for the being of small capacity, there is no greater object of attainment than a rebirth as a human or a god. That's sort of their ultimate aim, what they are striving for, although that may be temporary. And so, even if one is pursuing the being, the sort of paths of the being of middling and great scope, one doesn't see that kind of rebirth as an ultimate aim. You're striving for liberation or the state of omniscience, but one needs to have such a basis, such a life, until one is able to achieve liberation and omniscience. So here, when we are training, even if one initially generates an attitude of the being of great capacity, one has to have a rebirth, a good rebirth as a human or a god, in order to be able to pursue that path to eventually gain liberation and omniscience. So even if it's not your ultimate aim, a being of middling and great capacity still needs to have the kind of support that comes from a human or a god rebirth that is developed through generating virtue.
뭐야 어디도 다 된다 저 당부 상급들 당연히 송기 동안에 와서 하다미 고바지 최주배 개발 소화하고 있어봐 계속해서 나타나다미 고바한테 그래도 대화 아래 동네 장시체를 대례단 연구를 교환 도둑이나 아시체를 대례탄에 레단 연구를 왕게 기치고 대례단 타로 삼로와 대대지 타고 삼로와 대대지 전부 대체해서 아치고 뭐야 동네를 타고 삼게들도 삼서 현대 판매도 라라 기회를 심지어 탐색 시야 다다와 대완들 매도 마시래 대완들 매도 심지어 탐색세고 또 그때와도 내가 갖고 그래 대체도 근데 대체 통계 가사 진주로 지금 그것에 근데 이제 가사 진주로 지금 대체도 안다네 내가 배워게 혼동하게 찾아서 변념하고 그냥 용용체 왜 그렇게 때 저번 법에는 소바테서 싫어 다들 아침에 좀다 많이 봐 아마 지금 이제 탐색을 지금 대체를 시키면서 또 이제 하는 뭐 진짜 레벨을 같이 뭐 진짜 텔레그램에 대해서 돌리게 가면 삼사 게임에서 이제 고함 받아도 내가 야야야야야야기 그런 요다 예배도 보내 고도 해버리죠 대체도 상계가 내가 가르가르로 또 가르가르 방송 것도 대소라네 좀 셀러위를 찾아서 하는 게 싫대 좀 배셔야 되는 게 있었어 텔레트버스 스tam버스 컴퓨터인지 근데 상계가 바로 저기에 좀 그런 센터 대사
So here, I'm not sure if you all are having trouble hearing the Tibetan. It's a little bit unclear. I'm not sure why the sound is like that, but I have gotten the basic idea here. So here, the need to gain a good rebirth is necessary not just for the being of small capacity, but here, again, if one is striving in the being of middling scope or great scope, one needs to have that kind of good support of a human rebirth in order to be able to continue to proceed. And here, going beyond just the kind of thought of getting oneself out of samsara, a being of great capacity recognizes that it's not suitable for me to just pursue my own liberation alone, just leaving behind all of the kinds of beings who have shown me great kindness, with whom I am interconnected. And so, for that sake, for being able to repay their kindness, I myself need to gain the kind of state of Buddhahood, one in which I have removed all faults and developed all good qualities, to be able to fully be of benefit to these other sentient beings. And so, for that purpose, one is striving in a way where you're making incremental progress, thinking I'm trying to remove all of my afflictions, my jealousy, my anger, my attachment, my pride, and not just for the sake of my own liberation alone, but to be able to benefit all sentient beings, to eventually be able to attain that state of Buddhahood wherein one has removed all faults, developed all good qualities, and has the ability to lead sentient beings in accordance with their capacity. So, reflecting in this way, we should set a good motivation, thinking that we are listening for to these teachings for the sake of being able to generate in our own mind these kinds of qualities for the benefit of all sentient beings.
Yeah, 참 됐어. 근데 뭘로 좀 됐는지 모르겠어. 근데 마음에 넣어자. 얘네 몇시 사람들이 좀 이렇게
Okay, Katrina, we've
좋아요.
Again,
내가 걔도 저리 맞다.
kirangi ki sabo kogi mindu ka karina. Nare.
Hello? Here, everything looks perfect. I'm not sure. You need to check from Sravasti,
Gather and Bichi, if you want to leave the meeting and rejoin, that might help the connection problem.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, gonda this yangyalchik. Sravasti, do you also hear the kind of distortion in the sound, or is it just me?
Yeah. No, we've heard the distortion in the sound. Gather and Bichi was saying that they think it's their poor internet connection. So we've
Okay.
asked them to leave the meeting, rejoin, and see if that will help.
Okay.
Sorry, I tried to interrupt earlier, but it was lost.
So he's gonna rejoin, or is he waiting for you guys to do something?
Gather and Bichi, can you please leave the meeting and rejoin? I think it's from your side.
Can you try to fix? I think here everything is fine. We have no issues.
Yeah. I don't think that it's okay, but rejoin. Then rejoin. Okay, yeah, we do that.
Yeah, sorry about the delay. It's just quite distorted and difficult to hear, so.
No problem at all. Gather and Bichi, can you please?
Yes. So Ryan is the coordination. He is working on the OpenS. So yeah, you can rejoin and see it helps.
Okay.
And just a reminder that when we get to page 142 in the English, we will be going back to page 91 and do the section from 91 to 104 that we have not yet covered.
Thank you, Katrina.
Okay. This looks.
That sounds much better.
Oh, can you hear us? Gerbujit, come on.
Sarah.
Yeah. Can you
Yeah,
hear?
yeah, yeah. Yes, now it's much better.
That this songs again.
This one.
Jason, 야를
아,
줘서.
뭐야. 뭐야. 나도 그래서 아주 랍쳐야 된디 방공부로 주기. 아니, 이 땅마다 그래 거요 봐. 아주 참된데 봐. 공부로 주기. 텐텐닝부 나를 소도와. 가든 마음에 멜로자. 그러봐. 사베 가서래. 메시 사베 쭈다테. 부부님 좀 저러야. 매포야 캐도셔스. 딘데버드 그생에만 겹살에 섬주라. 럽소와.
Love song. 순서.
딘데. 디 셰요라. 다 딘데. 데바나리아 데 소도와. 가소다. 셰다스 남셰르 벌레세. 디로와. 남셰르 벌레 좀 된데. 기타 담바. 동반이세. 남셰르 벌나리아. 산제 좀 된데 송변도. 담바 동반이 템변도 세도 롱장도와. 딜레세. 레장 유세. 냐왈 계시 메케벨레 사담멜레 계시 게벨레라 소바테조 요레소라 넘버 메바 요라스 테나미 껴와치마 녜송레 껴와다 사담멜레 껴와야 요레소라 넘버 메바 요라스 제바보네 미미소세 티껴랑게게 제바보 껴랑게게 제바보 엘레 풍불레 때 셴베 야 따텐데시 요마레소라 Sendele yubeta, pumbule tuen shebeta che, tetene, manjuri che pique, kiwachima pumbulange drogeche yomare sungara. Cheba bone mami mimiso, sheba nese. Ta merbesana, ta meva mare sera, din donal sungara. Pumbu namla te ming tagbe rose. Pumbu ngabala tene, ene taase. De mere, de lare, de palare, de tare, de pachure, se pa ming tak pa samli asha ko de sugara. Pumbu nga na le ta yenge che yo mare. Pumbu nga bo te le ten shembe. Mumbo sebu na shepe kaga che ne tenge ta che yo mare se. Roa. Ene, te sonda kyo achima dronge ke chen de ta de manjuru che pumbu le ten shembe ta che te manjuru che kyo achima dronge che yo mare sugara. 가든 마음에 멜로자스도 빼지 않을 소소아 요 말해서라 대인하고 대지 대바리 좋아 참도 고 교환라는 넘버 멤버 교시마치 요야 요래 송도와 넘버 멤버 요래 제바보네 메미소 셰바네 풍부 남라테 맹다베시로스 다나 풍부 소보다 셈다 초아다 두시테즈 다레베도 텔레고 타데베 다치에 요마라 다 메르베스나 다 메바 마레세 풍부 남라 대 맹게 답으시로서 소보다 셈다 소라다 연계텔이야 디 다레 대화 동행 연계의 가사를 디 트시레 디 tundu레스 때네 맹 답으삼을 샤고레스 때네 답으사 풍부라 때네 답으삼을 다 샤고레스 아니 초와데도 녀선에 다가 대화녀 동행 녀세 소보 고제존의 드스나 다드로 테삼리아 때제 때제네 아니 자와생게 시 툭기어레 tel야 다 샤고레 다 요레 때네 딱바섬지 다 요레세 어디시 존나야 미미소 셰바나 풍부남라 대명 딱베시로스 디바도야
So here we are picking up in the text on page 134 in the English. We had last time talked about this quotation from Nagarjuna's Essence of Dependent Arising, where he states that recitation, oil lamp, mirror, seal, magnifying glass, seed, something sour, and a sound. With these, the learned know that the conception of the aggregates also takes place without being transferred. So here then, as a kind of commentary to this from Vasubandhu's presentation of reason. And I'm just going to state that this entire quotation does not appear in the Tibetan. We have it here in the English, but it's not all quoted there. So here it says, the Blessed One says in the Sutra of Ultimate Emptiness, so Sutra teaching emptiness, that karma exists, maturation also exists, however, do not observe an agent. So here the question arises, well, if it is the case that there is nothing that transfers from one life to the next, then someone might think that there's no self whatsoever. But here in this sutra, this Buddha has taught that there is virtue and non-virtue that lead to particular ripening results. Beings take rebirth. However, there is no self apart from the aggregates. If we are to say, though, is there no self whatsoever? Well, there is a self, but it is something that is merely nominally designated independence upon those aggregates. There isn't some kind of self that is distinct and apart from that basis of designation, wherein we could look at it as something separate like blue and yellow, but rather through merely dependently designating on the basis of these five aggregates. We have form and feelings and consciousness and discrimination and karmic formations. And then in dependence upon that, we are able to designate a self. But that isn't the case that there is some sort of self apart from those aggregates, nor are any of the individual aggregates the self. So here, it is something that is merely nominated, going to the bottom of that quotation, because then its name is imputed to the aggregates. So the person exists conventionally, but not substantially, because we can say the name is imputed to the aggregates. So we can say, oh, that's Tashi, that's Tundrup. I'm doing this activity when our aggregates or our body are doing that activity. However, it's not something that exists in and of itself, that exists separate from the aggregates, but it's something that's merely designated independence upon that basis of designation.
Oh yeah. This one.
This one.
She led on Nami Yujas, Le Kiwata Mikiwe Le Yoris, Le Nami Kiwa Sangelayete Yoris. Sendi Da Jude Chimar Pura Cheba Bone Mimi Barsoso. Sendi Da de. That go there Vachashana. Chiriba ine ta takba yora, kyo ngama ta tera manjur che tanda yore, tande ta de kyo chiman dronge che manjur che dhura. Kumbu din jur de yor mada ta de, nangi chebe kibus nalo de kun juwa meba takba che yosi yora. O tende de yor ma re se so ti tandar sungu yora. Tiende ko tsende ta de manjur che, ngaranzu samli nale kyo chiman lang shido, soso de namsa basore. Manjuri che pan dronge yobare samlo ti yomara ti sung yora sende ta de sende keba jibe ta de kyo chima duma ti mambo jurje kale bal menda cha yang yudo yora ti nga jo khadu mame melon cha se to so she so atalia sabe le ten nyu chi de sabe to kambute nyu de do yomara top to kale nyu de marwa sabe to ta sabe kale ma lombare ene koti medachi entine lombara chabachu tine ya che ene kali ngombo ya sha do do o tinde che ko rim ji cha yo armado top the college to the rich you are this on Gora. Oh, Chebabo Meber, Song Shense. Chine Chimmer poet Chebabo Meber Sonshe. Then a Chinagin do Zuji Kebashi Berson, the Keber Padules. This Chibata Nambani, the Kawalan Dante Mendra and do Zuji Kebare Songora. Keber Padu Sangete, Lobo Tuzu Drubjis and get a zero. Tambu Chiruba Chetane, Sanje, the church is Hakon and Namba Sanjiba Juruba. Dane Tumba Champagne, Chumdechola Capsis. This is led to Shannon, Cumingali and dead. Tanga Tumba Shanda Pancha, Sanje Chumde Chesu do Yesera. Caresana. This Sanje Chusung at the Cume by Yundendose. Mudiba Church to Kaja Lopton Chabayana. Sanje Church the Tendus until the Tabaki to station the Tanga number Sora. Ra. Tana Tumba Champagne, Chumdechola Capsis. This is led to Cumingali and dead. Mudi Shanji Shulula Chida Namsamba. Teta Guanchula Tau in Tabajas. Mudibe shown to the Tenet, Kazeta, Sanje shown to the Tedeco, Sajel Tabakeso, Namba Juri Roachema, Lobby to Juntrus. Oh, take some way, some less Yora. Kebar Padu is a Gepecha Shora, Sanje showed the Kebar Pabacho de Chasse. Oh, Tina Garson Resina. Lula Lucien Tado Nesse. Send the Lug Dane. In that talk was a turn, Lucien da, Joachime Lucinalia. Zushu chen de Russia verse ti yo maris oda lule lushe ta do ne tawe so ne poshish ta ase chiru ba ta to de shanda de sigdo serwa ta se de tawe so ne poshta so se de ta le sigora chiru ba nyam do ke shedu so sigdo a de re de yana so se de se de so choye pa du tenge ta de and then Manjuri said, Joachima to the Yomaris, and the Conan de Yora. Send the source the Luda Roacasera. A 7 Joma Chebis Tesona, so Yora. Oh, Casera. That is all you said. Oh, Lula Lucien Tadone, Travel saw ne Poshitras, that on that Alcovora. Send the solda, net and Gangitati, send the Tati. Joachima Manjurja po Yomaris. Chiruba to the Sigus stars. Church Lule Shan Jurbe, Sony Yabame, Sanje Chumden, the churches ora, Lule Ngota debe, Luda, Semda, Soan, the Shipumungale, Ngota de Tezola, Tush, Martin, Pekagayenge, Mombo Sebunashi, or today in Gate Ade, Meba Sosha Asera, Pumbula Tunsha Betasera. Oh, in the castle. Church Lule Shan Jurbe, Sony Yaba Mishi Sosa. Lule Pumbule Ngota de Beta Meba Soshas. Pumbule Ngota de Beta and Tata Batagora. Pumbu Juashi, Tan Juadoma, Resura. Take your Chiman to the Zakota de Podura, Yamane Deo Tanda de Maubana, Juachi Mevasakota de Ora. Oh, Tende Yoma Resudaya, or Dishilana.
So here then, this is saying that although there is karma and maturation, so virtue and non-virtue bring about their various effects, there is rebirth. There is no self of this lifetime that is an agent that is transferred to the next lifetime. So this passage also indicates the difference between Buddhist and non-Buddhist assertions. So here, it isn't the case that somehow the self of this life is like transferred unchanging to the next life. Whereas there are non-Buddhists who would assert that there is some kind of a permanent self that is separate and apart from the aggregates. Like our aggregates transform and are changing, but there is this permanent self that somehow goes to another life without transformation or without changing. When we actually look at how this is, the sort of self of this life is changing moment to moment to moment to moment and becomes a different self, we could say, in the next life. So for example, like when you have a seed gives rise to a sprout, but it isn't as though like that seed, that's something that is hard and dry, is just suddenly, boom, a sprout. but rather when you present it, when you put it in the right conditions, you make it wet and moist and give it heat and moisture and all of those things, then a seed will transform into a sprout in stages. It isn't the case that somehow suddenly that transforms or the nature of the seed becomes the sprout. So this is highlighting the kind of difference between Buddhists and non-Buddhists in their views. So then we have a quotation from Udbata Siddhi Swamin's praise of the exalted ones. And so Udbata Siddhi Swamin was someone who was previously non-Buddhist, and he has this quotation that has, it goes something like, I previously had followed non-Buddhist texts or looked at the non-Buddhist kind of texts, but you have taught something that isn't there, that is unique. And so he says that having given up all of those kinds of non-Buddhist teachers, he now seeks refuge in the Buddha. He's given rise to faith in the Buddha's teachings. So here from his text, having again looked at all of the teachings of the Buddha and seen that, well, in my non-Buddhist text, there were all of these faults, but the Buddha has presented things in a way that is faultless. He has this then praise of the exalted one. So from that, it says, others, non-Buddhists, accept that a subtle life force, i.e. a self, transfers from this body into another body. So here, the kind of life force, again, some might posit this as somehow like a soul. There's some kind of a self that is not connected to those aggregates, that is separate and apart from them, that somehow transfers from this body, the kind of life that we have right now, into another. And so as opposed to that, you, the Buddha, said a life force that is separate from the body does not exist. So some kind of life or soul or self that is separate from our aggregates. You look through and you can't point to it as being a form or consciousness or feeling or discrimination or karmic formations, but somehow something that is of a different nature than those aggregates, somehow permanent, that moves from this body to the next. The Buddha has said a life force that is separate from the body does not exist.
Oh yeah. Tene gombo lutu je salu jambe silu urche bale. Gombo lutu je salu jambe doyen dreba silu urche bachi ora. Sije jabi. O dinal dire son shas. Kare son dosuna. Jiden dine paru ton drove chunga kana mese. Jiden che dine. Ane taade. Manjuri che ne paru drogechi. Kana mese gora. Ngogo kanga tende risirba chik chidu. Saburaji tabna koko tab shabate manjur che ya dwe nyuku ngombu chaya tam beto chaya che yo marwa. Kokora tichel chi tichel medrash en paru chili panche yungu to chilo ngobu to sa. O tina she taade ko sendi taade manjur che tende yo marde ko medrash cha tende so sona chimateliya ti gyun medrash leb yungu wara. Ti pechana tamalya mabu do cha soa. Oh, de soda. Silur chabale. Jiten dine paruton roe chunga kanaya mese. Yenjan judan ken tale legend drebungo bayes. Yina judan ken sokwala tene. Sendele judan chi yobase. Chimatele pa ti ringde chimadrose jujinji sande yona. Chimadele drabuchi lebyongo arako. Tina shi kyunyi chimachi. Tangma te tina shi takba chene tina korango tira tene yang roe chide yomara. Yina jurgi che do shagre sura. Paru to do chune. Wenjan kudan kenta le legend rebungo ba yose legend rebu kyo chima yo re songora. Oh, special sura. Chidar melon yo chilas. Melon tangma chini tangma sunye shar tunge tangma chiyona. Telia ane sing so tong de tadi pa tongu doase. Ti pacho tende de so sujo de jujin chiyone. 소디 중어마도 돈데네 시파데 나로 drogo 마레 송고도아 티탈 페샤네 셰소가 마보 셰소 송예데 지차네 송예 동자 니마 다웨 송예 주 무자 마보 추다 지 멜론다 셰고 텐데 텐나 차드라 텐나 파치 이네 요 텐나 슈체 드레케 요 마라 이게시 유테 규진데 지 상서나 대단 라와시 비레비 요거라 티 치마치 치 레비 요거도아 오테나 셰레 Mame tale pe chaswa. Mame to paz chasona. Mame chi de te manjur che pan re ke mara. 놈다 동래다 대저 연하고 지기젤리 지기제 코라코라래 거라 놈다 네 동래도 조선에 영해요 말아 저거 실로데 규진 상대 파두고 그러마도 나마데 되나 마주르제 파두에요 말스 티페 마무차는 소소아 작자세요 자 깨데 겨데 되네 깨타시데 파타 다 땡산데 깨주페네 깨지시데 잠불 가스칼 조도 Tiko gyujin sangdi pige mashindi tata yoni tenal shike te toyo kudwa. Mashindi toz mandina toyo medwa, tenga zungu sum chudero. Me ti tenal shu che se ke medwa. Te tenri si so de ne pajo den gyujin si tele lebdo kudwa. O di sungu wara. Droya chunga kana me. Gyudan kenda legin debu. Penda melo yon che la shingi sunye nawa shirwa. Melo nandu sunye ne po yoba mayino se. Melona le soñet ba per dresi ke yo marwa. Ke je she shabati te majuji tenal ba shu dresi ke yo mar. Pajo de chujin sa yene ko namsan te matado te da leb dorwa. Soñet mig ba she sharwa. Melona do soñet ne po yo ba mayeno se. Chidara dawa rene ba sta dawa da nimato chibarwa. Ta reng bul yo re. Yena chudo zo kange dal te soñet pe Chudam bumda tongju changme bum yongura 가서 춘에 총이 나도네 추럽지 내잖아 루샤네 되나 송에 차용구라 전에 다 대신 되네 치포와 가면 좋아게 왔나 대신 되네 치포와 풍불에 등에 셈베 다지 딱 봐지 표현해 아니 겨와 심마트날 슈도에 텐데요 말했어요라 가면 좋아게 왔나 얘네 겨와 심마 요아레세 겨와 심마람 되네 세대 풍분히 잡자서 소보치다 파마 내진들은 파마라 소바 텐데 겨와 심마 좋아요 게디 상하체 엔진에 고마 세대 나와도 넘드도 텐다우지 베게 랩도 요라 규진 상한데도 텔랩도 요라 됐어 뭐네 가면 좋아게 와르낭세 엔디메도 어디 말로션 가서라 규진 마사 멤버 규진 마사나 멤버야 요 말에 규진 사수는 멤버 용도 메시다 메니마다 메시데 소 거저데 또 멤버십 멤버십에는 멤버는 거라 그 당분에 메시데나리 쇼니 치치고에 메도아 멤버의 규진 사수는 멤버는 거도 규진 마사는 멤버가 말와 디날 때세 규진 마사 멤버세 규진 사는 바로 하시사 규진 마사 멤버래 부모님 좀 좋아요. 주단께 창고여라 버저대 때에는 본부대 시계질 튀니 균파 균튀의 용해대 요래서 거라. 인심 좋으시도 참 좋아. 다들 셰바다 샘다 도저간가 참체로 말아 코나 균심을 지시게지 튀의 레벨이라 참 좋으실 때라. 다 참체수선은 다 배시에 매서는 참체라. 참하제베시 균이지 참 좋은데 루래서 거라. 아니 가서 그래서 부분이 좀 저러 여셔라 춘대 송예 미과시에 추나도 나와라다 니말라 소바테도 송예데 자자 템부만부 미그와 미과신도 에네 티신 디네 치포와 가면 좋아케와나 티신 디네 치포네 pom불 떠셴베 따따바 만주라 제제치 동게시케요 마레세 이나야 로에케와 치마데 나그레세 케와 치마 야코 레 사발라 테네 테제부 겨시마야 겨시라야 요레스 거라 셰다서 티버드 실로나
So then next we have a quotation from Nagarjuna's verses on the rice Seedling Sutra. So Nagarjuna has this commentary which is written in verse. And so it says then, nothing whatsoever goes from this world to the beyond. Nevertheless, from causes and conditions, the effect of karma manifests. So here, the self of this life, it's not as though unchanging somehow goes to the next life. life, but rather there's this transformation, this kind of constant transformation. Like when we have a seed, that seed has the potential to give rise to a sprout and a flower and all of those things, but it's not as though the sort of essence of the seed transfers into that somehow unchanged, but rather it's from that seed becoming something slightly different, slightly different, slightly different, and moving that it then becomes, it transforms into that sprout and that flower. So there is a kind of causes and conditions that come about, and that leads to effects in the same way as will come below in these explanations or these examples that illustrate this, like the reflection of a face in a mirror. It's rather that things proceed to transform into something of a similar type. There is a continuum, but we can't have something that is somehow unchanging that moves to the next world. So, for example, this is just as in a clean mirror, one sees the image of a face, but the image does not transfer into the mirror. And just as the distant moon appears in a small vessel of water, but it is not transferred there. So again, we've given lots of examples before, but when all of the causes and conditions are present, we have, say, the reflection of a face in a mirror. When that mirror is clean and you have a face nearby, you are going to have the appearance of that reflection. But it's not as though the face entered into that mirror. Or if you have reflective surfaces and the sun or the moon is out, you will have all of those reflected objects in those various, say, vessels of water. But it's not as though the moon is transferred into that. It hasn't entered in somehow, but when the causes and conditions are correct, you will have the appearance of that kind of a reflection. And so too, when we have something like a butter lamp, that seems as though the flame of that is continuous. It's somehow like this constant unchanging thing, but yet it's changing moment to moment, and it is dependent upon the oil that is in there and the wick and so forth. And when those run out, that thing is over. It ends. It's not as though anything were transferred or somehow removed, but rather the causes and conditions cease to allow that flame to burn. Or like an echo, we can have a voice, you say something, and then it is sort of reflected back. It's not as though that voice is somehow transferred. And we can see these days you can use, like, say, the internet to project your voice to all kinds of different corners of the world. It's not as though your voice is transferred there. And as we have just had a direct sort of experience of, when the causes and conditions are not right, it's not going to happen. And when the causes and conditions, this 건다 again, 삶아서. Samason. So here we can have, as these kinds of examples demonstrate, that when we have something that is like the image of a face in a mirror, it doesn't transfer into the mirror, and just as the distant moon appears in a small vessel of water but is not transferred there, karma and its functions exist. Likewise, at death, nothing transfers from this life, but a being is born. If the causes and conditions are not complete, a fire does not burn. Once they are complete, the fire burns. And so here again, we need to have all of the kind of causes and conditions. Like, for example, if you have a magnifying glass that can cause fire to start, it's not as though fire is somehow transferred from somewhere else, but when all of the causes and conditions are present, you are going to have that come about. And so too, when we have from complete causes and conditions, the aggregates of a new life arise. And here it's really it uses this language of ning-sam jorwa, like to have a connection with something. So there is a continuity in the sense that causes of a similar type lead to a sort of result of a similar type. But like all of these examples, nothing is somehow transferred. Just like the moon reflected in water, nothing transfers from here at death, but a being is reborn. A being connects to another life based upon the continuity of causes of a similar type. But there is no permanent self. So there's no contradiction between denying a permanent self, but also asserting that there can be rebirth. Yeah, Disha.
That is, yeah. Then Jebale Jasungdo, Jiden Dine, Jiden Parulam, Jiden Parune, Jiden de Po Angaya Mesera, Sheba Ne, Site Niparu Tombo Mambuyora, Mambuso, Sheba Ne, Juda Ge, Masawa Mebete Leg, Debunga by Yodo, She Song So Satire, Otilo Shandigua.
So then from the commentary to that, the auto commentary to that, and it may be a longer verse than or a longer section than we have here, but since nothing whatsoever transfers from this world to the next or from the previous one to this one, don't you have to propose permanence, no cause, or a discordant cause? And there's something that comes between that. And then the Buddha said, because the causes and conditions are complete, the effect of the karma manifests.
Oh yeah. That did it. That did Toba Kudoa, Toba, Kadesana. Ona Gombo Lutu Jesalu Champion Dodile Sumbatar. Tadeta de Kyoangamane de Yoya Yomare. Dine Tandeta de Kyochimapa, Doya Yomare Susonwa. Tata Tapasine Pumbule Tertian Beta, ya Tad Manjura Chipan Drea Yomarese. And Kina ne tomba sanje ki de son do asan do na le sanje ke tare son do sena ngani te se te te na kole chue kebo ane ka sore mambu ko wa she cha wa gyur do se sanje chum den de ngema ane jide je kam de ne ya kole chue kebo mambu ko wa she cha wa gyur do se 정말 왕주 측에 아니 메마보 저런 개발체로 지야 원구샤게 원제트샤게 텐데시 메마보 그 땅아주 될 땅게시 고도 키라 개발체로 땅부 개발 텐데시 세거라 던도다도 제시를 꾸마고 텐데시게시 걸리걸리 쇼이사로 근데 따도 생게 미트라가라시야 고샤래 키라 따도 시야가 상관주 키라리아 Druitanto Nanyabanda taking his lord and take Cabos Lavsara. Mambuku Cabos. Teach Elako Koran got the chair and take Puta to Putus Japans and a Cabu Cutus Shora Sashora or Telo Juti Nashire. Oh, Tenesha Juto. College you a cabo. Mambuku Ashawa Jura Sodoa. And the Sanjachum then they thought college you a cabo take. 다 지금 많이 나네 때 컨데스 요르게래서요라 때 균치마래 시그시 조제 제제만 요르게 제제 균치마를 때려서 요르마도 그 산제가 다 되다 네 망부고에 개비 다 니데 시그래서 딱봐 산제가 다 되라 녜메 망부고에 개비 다 되 만주르제 단도 산제가 다돼 내도 텐데 말을 속여래서 진짜 인성교 말이 규칙과 인성교 아래 말도 다니 식 말해서 딱 봐서 만주리 식 봐서 대대 말해서 그라 콜레지에 개보교도 시자와 송바단 개와리 줄대서 만부고에 개비 다다 덤바산제게 다니 식 많이 베셔시나서 대교요 말해서 다 가지 껴줘라 롱데 덤바산제다 만부고에 개보니 규타대 말해서 규칙 말해 대 줄게 세대 규치마 들렸던 relevant 거라 규칙 말에 규 타대 말해서 배나 러시다 전도스 간사니네 규 타대로 왔고요. 근데 말해서 규칙 말에 규 타된 거고요. 얼마도 저기 뒤가서라. 샤자도베 다 찍마인 배셔서 롱데네 tomba 산제다 마부고에 개보니 규 타대 bar 규타대 바간 규타대 말에 규칙 말에 규칙 말와 규 신내시 규대 코니엘레셰셰 근데셰 용거라 규타대 까기와래 규칙 봐 규타대 까니 규칙 봐 근데 땡겨래서 이제 간사님같이 다니데 찍래서 근데 땡겨 말해서라 이노서 나니 대세 셰베 나야 takbe dale songuyo amare rangune drube dale segyo amare pumbule tenshembe tarwa takchi rangwa chenge dale segyo amare ane rangune drube dale segyo amare sa ane kaisar takba da rangune drube dala cheba mayimbar tanye je shirjube tanye je wange shakbe dadile segyo are sa teya tuju kebado chene soso chene mena तादे तुंदे तादे तादे ने दिले जुर रहे तादे तादे को माउबन थे जुर्ग मारवा ते जुरने शंदा से ने बाहर ढोगरवा तादे तादे जो छिमत ना डोय ने 교와시마 하이나 다데다데 미셔 교와시마 하이네 ene miti lare dugo lada miniga yambare chagira tinde dwa mare sora so chene mena dedar merunwa tuji kebar to maje bar ta chi samla chebasa chitane ta de korang ta gi chudi tanda sanje re de ngoma tinde chaju samba de shi chawa jure ngema tinde chore se o chuji bal chene sogyo re sora ya tichi loshana
Mm.
to
So
ta
then,
lapsa rama lo na de yeah.
no. So then the kind of question or qualm arises. Again, if there's nothing that transfers, then as Nagarjuna's extensive commentary on the Seedling Sutra states, this present self does not come from the former lifetime to this lifetime and does not transfer from this lifetime to the next. If this is so, then this contradicts the Buddha's statement in the sutra that says, I was at that time the universal ruler known as King Mahasamata. This is because the self of King Mahasamata and the self of Shakyamuni would not be the same. So here, there's kind of a question that arises. If there is this lack of a permanent kind of unchanging self that continues, that is in the prior life and then goes to a future life, and just to give the background to this universal ruler, this wheel-turning king, that is, it's actually sort of his name means like greatly praised by all. It said that there was at a certain time prior to there being kings, I mean, people had their harvests and so forth, and they tried to protect and keep their grain, and then people would be stealing that. And so they thought that, well, we need someone to look after us, to sort of protect us from that, and appointed this person as king. By giving him a gift of grain, then they will receive sort of protection so that their things will not be stolen and so forth. And then his sons will continue on that sort of tradition. So here, the Buddha speaks about having been this universal ruler, this king in the past, and it's saying that I was at that time that universal ruler known as King Mahasamata. And is this then saying that those are the same, or what is this indicating? So the answer to this sutra citation refutes the position that the Buddha and Mahasamata are two separate mental continua, and just indicates that they share a single continuum. So it does not show that the former and latter selves of those two beings are the same. So this is not indicating that somehow these are exactly the same, as though there's a single sort of being, person that somehow transferred to the next life. It doesn't involve some kind of lasting self like that, but rather is establishing that they are of a single continuum. When you have like two separate people, Tashi and Tundrup, they have different continua, different sort of continua to them, and they are refuting that they are of two separate continua, but it isn't the case that this self then is completely distinct. So moreover, the I in the phrase I was at that time does not mean a self that is permanent and established from its own side, but means the mere I that is the basis of a conventional term. If you also say that this I is distinguished by a specific time, you are incorrect. This is the kind of general I that covers the mere continuum, the continuum of a mere general self that is not specified by time.
Oh yeah. That is my lotion that Tamal Sasha. Tedana Chisele, so Lobin Dawatra, Uma Chisayor, was our Shira with the Chisele. And a Carson dosena. Onan dole digetos, then Donald the rest of the Anite, na college Kabo Mambuko, Shechawa, Juro, Shed the Bachidar, Chashanas, Tatagitama the Chibaredoa, take a resonance. Katene, Shani and Bangoba Lurchaban. Kate, Sanje Kate, college, Sanje Chomden, college, Kabu, Nega, Kabuteta, Sanje Nibuti, Ta de Kunchik by Songiormato, Tita de da Kunita Chigre, Takwares, Tendesongo Maresora. Shani and Bangoba Lurchaba Inge, so Teres, Lurchabas and Torchaba Inge. Chingi to Tambachebane, Mayano, Shebarchao, Shebane, Tagbani to Juro, Sete, Humbuleto, Shambata, Tende Tachiona, Tandeta, Teram, Pajon, Juran, and Tabaredors, Commandurche Pandugora. 니바 셰스도 셰소소 어디에 말로샤나 딸 된다 셰차샤 지버려. 야.
No. So this then is supported by this quotation from Chandrakirti's Clear Words, which is a commentary to Nagarjuna's fundamental verses on wisdom. And so here, this really illustrates the same point that was made above. So question, a sutra states, I was at that time the universal ruler known as King Mahasamata. How should we understand this statement? And the answer to that, these words, and this is actually more that's in the Tibetan, but these words emphasize a refutation of their being totally separate and of their being one. Because of not being separate and not being one, at that time, the Buddha was saying he, King Mahasamata, was not another continuum at the time. And so what is wrong with saying that king is the Buddha, where the former and the present would be one? And so then there's already the sort of fault. I've already indicated the fault when I said the self would be permanent. So here we can't have the prior self of the Buddha somehow be exactly the same as the Buddha of this life, but rather this is indicating that they are of a single continuum.
오야. 당한 주던 제 가가를 지래서.
Mhm.
땡들라 뚜뚜기 단조네 봐세. 땡진 레버 좋아서도 망보지 손에는 수직 좀 용거라. 자, 땡들라서 샹달라 땡지 망보지 수순 젤네. 직질을 뜨네 지금 뭐 가가 샤고라. 나바 로체게나 땡지 많이게 뭐지요 말아. 뭐 직장장 지금 거랑 두개요 말아. 망보지 손에 대sol라 뜨신 젤네 내가 생겼다. 데 강바레 데 메레 데 따레 데 컴퓨터레 샤워 데 남루레 샤워마도 라와도 드바치 데레스 직장장게 내가 생겼지 두개요 말에. 두테데시나 두테데 촌촌다 차장의 치주맹게 두테지요 말에. 두도도 초르다는 고셔치 자야맹게 그런 로봇치맹게 두고를 차게요 말에. 그래도 그 대신 젤네 뭐부 간거 샤고라. 땡데데 산제 송에데 빼 개sem부 예생 고불루도 저저 때바때도사 망셔데 땡데 송베 코네 때바때고 사게라. 땡제 데버리 좋아세. 치 땡제 데버리 좋아세. 니치기 지데 간가 치치레 땡제 델네 tukyo레세. 나게 땡제 데버리 좋아세. 나게 간주 깨왈라네. 가사도서 깨왈란도 땡데 야라 중니 셰게도 텔라 나게 땡제 데버리 좋아세 거래. 치 땡제 데버리 좋아세나 Zambuli Kandesi Chare, Lunda Sada Chuda Med Tazu Kanga Chone, and it's Chishin Naxella Soba Kandis Trugures, Chi Tenji Deberjoa Sogua. So the Nobu Kanga Tenji Deberjoa. Tadia Tenji Deberjoa. Sobodan, Semdan, Sorodan, Tazu Kanga La Tenji Delne, and it does a shower mado. Das engaging us engaged in and chicken sutu de Vecchio 어때도 남배 로리아 텐데 패케이션 붙여요라. 교단 텐데 망보지 소소는 담면데 두개요라. 텐데 마소네 치 고기요세 지그네 제바보도 삼루타네 두개요 말했어요라. 어때도 다 텐데라 뚜뚜게 단조네 바 스테셔요다. 오나 살루 잠베 돌레선 도나를 산제 송고도 군주게 텐데 데버 조아 kumju banasa kuzu gete debra joa kumju se roa ene te son de karson re kande mare pe gen duchi se te yala choni khoa khordan de ngazu samltan de thome mare ba kunela ene ngeban duchi ge lesa ene sumba namshele pa sha tene kewala ne shiba mesu ngaba ke te yala choni pa che yongo do o te she yora kunzu bete debar joa sungbana karasungors kande mare beke duchise khoa kandes kogers tambo nga samse nga nechu de yabuji mashin basha ta sosu nechu de sosu de kande yimate yabuji mashin basha ti de zako kasora ngao nyamdo nga rawa che yoba samte nor de segora nga samsa nga rawa che yoba samlo ti nor de se ti marik ba segora 친질러레스 마리바스 ngoy nesuta timba mares ngone yobati de timba mare tele 친질러 바스 제기어스 마리바스 ngone de toyo mares ngone de mashin bere no ne chi sam tangyor se tanda marik ba she gora thome marik ba se ene yewan du chi le sa en sumba nam she she tende yala chu ni ga ju she yo ba o te ju so go da te jen de bare jo wa kum ju sumba na kan de marik ba chen jen du ji she so sumba da se ene number chave tende so nam jang se de number chave tende so bana se do ane ka so God she so da se mari bang gak ben du chin ga she so ye kune nyom ba da number chave tende so bana o tere kune nyom ba tende se de tome mari ben ni ban du chi ke ko da ko lu she si go ra te kuku ju te ba le te ne debu tunge te ba ju ne ko da she do te la kune nyom ba tende se go ra ta number chave tende se tome mari ba ge jim na she yo mare se ta me ba kom ta me ba ngu sum du to so na ne tome mari ba ga ene ni ban du ji yo mare sum ba nam she yo mare se go de da lam de ni di she yo ra kune nyom ba tende she du sa ko da ku lo tunge te ba da kun ju te be ko ne ko da di she yo ra number chave tende she du sa lam de da go de ji ko ne lam de kom ne nyom se ne tar wa tu ju di she yo ra cheso da mari banga ben dujin ga cheso ji kune nyomo bada number chave tende kumju somba da sheba da ta dambe ngore tande ta dambe tende kumju somba na tenyele somba sharibu tenje debra jo chomde de yang da ba somba kan la la ta yang da ba shirab ji yang da ba chita wa shindu takbar gyundu so me wat teng tambe tende sondu sa tongba ni de songu do tongba ni komne ni kwale tarwas ti she do so me ba da ta me ba da she ba da tongba da ta me ba da ya da ba thong wa de ne chi de be te na o te te ma da sa o ti ba de chi kyu de ya na ya da ba chi da wa shi do she so ba te ni le Sumba sharibu tenjen rebar jwa chumden de yang dagba sumba de kaan lala shi ki yang dagba shirab je tedar chitawa shindu takbar me bata rawa midagba toya sigura taa me ba rawa taa me bata shiba ne tongba da tongwa da taa me ba yang dagba tongwa tene tongwa tene taa debe dusu chunga rawa du trube taa takbe taa tende debe dusu chunga rebe maungbe dusu takbe taa rawa taa de maungba na yungu rebe o tende le samgu tanga maare sungu wara samgu maare se taa meba to sunu sungu yordo o tiba tu chi gyu na maungta sa
So here we next turn to this topic of the ability to posit a dependently existing self within dependent arising. Now here, dependent arising is such an important kind of topic in Buddhism. Many causes and conditions coming together is what leads to the various phenomena that we see. So here, the Buddha has asserted that there are no things that are not dependently originated. There's nothing that exists in and of itself without this kind of relationship of being dependent upon others, being interrelated and causally dependent and so forth. And so we can talk about things, oh, there's a horse, there's a plane, there's a computer, there's this, there's that, but it's not as though any of these phenomena are established from their own side without being dependent originations, whether that is dependent upon various causes and conditions or parts upon our mentally labeling them. There's nothing that exists in and of its own right. Like even if we are to try to go down to the smallest atom, the smallest particle existing, that somehow we could assert, oh, that thing exists in and of itself without it depending upon anything else, we can't do so. But rather, this teaching of dependent origination is extremely important for Buddhists. We see so many of the masters praise the Buddha, particularly for his teaching on dependent origination. And the Buddha taught in a kind of external dependent arising related to our environment, the world that we live in, how things come about through the various elements, wind and earth and water and fire and so forth. And then there is the internal dependent arising of the presentation of the 12 links of dependent origination. So whether it is the external world or our internal, the process of a being taking rebirth, all things are dependently originated. So the self, which is then dependent upon the aggregates. This is something where it doesn't, again, exist in and of itself, but rather when the causes and conditions come together, there can be a self that is merely dependently designated. So here, when we look at like the assertions of non-Buddhist schools, they might think that something comes about due to the sort of thought of a creator or the power of a creator. Here, this is refuted through the teachings of the Buddha that say, no, all phenomena are interdependent, are dependently originated. And so therefore, when teaching the method of meditating on conventional dependent arising, the Buddha said in the Rice Seedling Sutra, depending on ignorance, conditioning factors arise and so forth. So here, this is getting into the dependent arising that is the 12 links of dependent origination, that internal dependent arising. Based upon that first fundamental ignorance, we then accumulate karma, the conditioning factors, that in turn place imprints on our consciousness, which in turn leads to name and form and the 6 sense bases and so forth. So we cycle based upon having this first thought of I. We think that there is an I that is somehow existent in the way that it appears to us, but it doesn't actually exist in that way. We have this sense of like this independent I that's somehow apart, separate from all of these causes and conditions or our mental labeling, but that is something that is mistaken. It's not in accordance with reality. And it's not just in relation to this person, our self there, but with regard to all other phenomena, we look at them this way. So so depending on ignorance, conditioning factors arise and so on. And likewise, with the cessation of ignorance, conditioning factors cease and so forth. So through this, you respectively understand the way of meditating on afflictive dependent arising and purified dependent arising. So here, when we have the kind of a side of the afflicted, so in dependence upon ignorance, conditioning factors, and so forth, describes the kind of process of the origin of suffering, how that leads to the truth of suffering. Those two are the Four Noble Truths. And then we have the side of the purified dependent arising. So I'm going to connect this with the quotation that comes below. So when the Buddha taught the way of meditating on ultimate dependent arising, he stated in the Rice Seedling Sutra, Reverend Shariputra, whoever by means of perfect discriminating insight sees this dependent arising perfectly, taught by the Blessed One accordingly, in reality, continuous, in perpetuity, without life, free of life, just as it is, unerring, unborn, and so forth, not made, unconditioned, unobstructed, baseless, peaceful, fearless, not to be taken away, not exhausted, not as an essential nature that is not pacified. So here, by reflecting upon, again, there is the afflicted side of dependent origination, and then the thoroughly pacified or the purified side, in which one realizes that through meditating on selflessness, one is able to avert that ignorance, stop that ignorance, which in turn stops the conditioning factors, stops the consciousness link, and so forth. And one is able to achieve a true cessation through exhausting the various afflictions. So here, one doesn't then think that there is some kind of permanent, enduring sort of self. Like, what was I in the past? How was I in the past? He does not reflect upon the future. How will I exist in the future or not exist in the future? In the future, what will I become? In the future, how will I exist? So one recognizes that all of these phenomena, even the self, is something that is a mere dependent origination. There is no sort of permanent, enduring kind of self that continues through various lifetimes, but it is rather a mere imputation.
Yeah.
No.
그래서
Jason.
어야 다 되려다 nga di tanda ha konde do she sung ba tar kunzu ta tan be tenjin driver jowe kumchu she ba le se do kunzu je tenjin driver jowa kumda de thome mari pe kunela niban du je le sa sumba nam she te tu pa che ya ka shi chung ni ba ka shi chi ru be ten ya samra ta de la kune nyomu be ten kumchu se yo ra number chawe ten kumchu se de 다 매바 토메 머리 바게 가르 송거에서나 마오 냠도 라웨 다요 반적이 와래 아니 라웨 다 매바 곰네 풍불이야 풍불에 되네 가서라 오 다대바 야 풍불이야 라웨네 주바 라웨 다 매대 예나 풍불나네 풍불에나네 야네 라고래 야매네 틸레셴네 라고래 티 강에 요 말에 풍불라 고 타대다 식다 타대 간도 요 말 다음에 때라 팝 아니 다음에 바토스도 토메 마르 바가도라 다음에 봉고심도 또나 토메 마르 바디 우마라 니 니번 두지 가레 네 소바 남셰건데 타르와 토주디 셰도와 군에 녀모베 텐데 kum주 셰도 그 동에 템바 그 군주 템바라 때는 제부 동에 템바 조주디 야부신게 와라 number jawe tende kumju de kombala tene kyu lamje temba kombala tene ene tarwa tobe nyomo sebe seba tobe yobade hako yora o jisu yora chesu kune nyomo bada tenda be tenjin debar jowe chu kombale sekdo kombola tene takba jamje ta se number jawe tende kumju shede kombola tene takba ta shegura dame togura dame tone tome mariba ngusumde tone tome mariba gadu tene nyeba doje gausi lamde kombale tene tarwa tuptu shegura o tuguni ko gasore tene takba samje kumbula tene takba samje ta yore serwa tuguni ji kone koara kongeda ku kunju temba leda nyomola tene Rebu tunge temba koa koge rwa ju lamje temba kombal tame togba lam kombal tene tarwa tomge ge taas o je tenjin reban jo tene takwa samje ta yoba de ha ko res gora tuguni je ko ne koara konge ta golam nye je ko ne tarwa tomge ge ta samshi ye ja se te yoba ha ko res yena chirube takwa na shinge kumbulle tenwe shenpe takji rawa chenje taa rawa o tene rawa dutuwe taa la soba teso meba she tupkire soba rawa we taa so meba she tupkire se ya tiba duchi lamna tambo mongta
So here, this will clarify some what comes below. It says then, from thus understanding the way to meditate on conventional and ultimate dependent arising, you recognize a self that is a mere imputation in dependence on the aggregates and that passes through cyclic existence by means of true sufferings and true sources. So you also see that there is a mere self that attains liberation by means of true paths and true cessations. So here, meditation on the side of the thoroughly afflicted involves understanding how it is that through holding to there being some kind of an autonomous, truly existent self, that then one gives rise to various karmas which make imprints on the consciousness, and thereby the forward sort of 12 links come into play. And so this is the side of the thoroughly afflicted, realizing that kind of relationship between the source of true sufferings and then the truth of suffering that results from that. Now, it is then, on the other hand, through understanding that, recognizing that there is no such self. If one realizes the selflessness of the self that one has held to be like autonomously, really, truly existent, existent. And based upon that realization of selflessness, one stops the ignorance that is the first in the link of the 12 links of dependent origination, and thereby understands the purified dependent arising, recognizing how one then stops this process of taking rebirth, dependent upon meditating on the path as understood as the selflessness of the person and so forth. One is then able to stop the resulting links. So one can create, one can achieve a cessation by means of understanding the selflessness that counteracts that fundamental ignorance. So again, you know that, however, you understand that there is no permanent self that is an entity separate from the aggregate, such as the non-Buddhists assert. And also you understand that there is no self ultimately established from its own side, such as the Buddhist essentialists assert. So here, one understands that even though there is no such self, this all works by way of there being only a merely designated self. There is no such permanent enduring self that is asserted by the non-Buddhists, or one that exists from its own side, as Buddhist essentialists assert, yet all of these dependent arisings still function.
Oh yeah, this one. Oh yeah. The concept that the better driver joe kumju shebale pumbula tene takwa samjita tugunye ji kone kwa kongeda golam ye ji kone tarwa tongenge ta samshi ye chance ta tanda namjan kasara kone nyama betende kumju sheduza tome marik bate nga samsa nga rawa yoban jengirese nga rawa yoban jena ane nyeban duje lesa na kwa kugres ti sheyora namjange temde sheduza tome marik baga nga o nyamdo nga rawa jimba nashi nga rawa yo marese karese na pumbula nga rawa chiyo na ane tsene nye yo kore sobo dere da sem dere da tsoa dere da karese na 다라고 말해서 계속다 랑원에 여나 풍부가부 가루나네 치체 그니 야고래 야나 풍부레 대셔베다 요고 띠요 말해서 돈다 가르치고 그래서나 랑웨 다 여나 풍부가부 가루 다야나 찍체네 요 그래 풍부가부 가루나네 찍다 해 그래 야나 풍부가부 레 셴베 대셔베다 치요 그래 띠요 말해서 풍부레 랑웨 다 메데 राववे तादे फुंबुदा चिक चेने यो मारे थादे चेने यो मारे संगो थादे चेने यो मारे शेवा तामे शेगदवा तामे से अंता ता मेर वसे योरे ता फुंबुले तेने तकबसमले ता शागोरे शेगरा थोमे मारे बादे फुंबुले तेने तकबसम माइबा राववे ता यो बंजेगदवा ति यो मारे से जे जिना ख्वा खोगरे शेगरा एने फुंबुले तेने तकबसम जिमातो रावद टुबे ता यो मारे ति मेबा कोना 남자 저기 때인데 샌데 람데 komne 고데 tum주도 शेगदवा ता तेले तेने करे 하고 그래서나 공부를 때네 딱 봤으면 있다요 그래서 치르벤 되었다 저기 라와신게 다다 랑원에 주베 다요 말해서 하나 다 근데 그래서 공부를 때네 딱 봤으면 있다데 코아 코르게레 람덴 공부할 때네 타바 투그레스 티하고 그래서 티셔요나 된데서 군주다 된다 베텐데 텐션 대바는 좋아 공주시에 벌어 공부를 때네 딱 봤으면 있다 그네 가서 때네 딱 봤으면 다 동해다 군주 때문에 지고네 코리에다 고란 고텐다 람데니 공부할 때네 타르와 통계게 다 잠시 요래서 치르벤 되바다지 풍불에 대신에 딱 받지고 라오에 다들 요 말해서 좋아 대신도 풍불에 랑원에 들어봐 집에 다들 요 말해서 딱배 다서 매버시보다 랑딩을 마와 남지 되바다를 더 담바 랑게 뭐 집에 다 매버 신기래서 Kumbule ten shambe takbe ta da ten tamba rangi ngoyo trube ta yebar sona yebar sone tende ta de ta tenye ngonje thala tende yena kyo ngamane ta chi ronje da yore chendele yor maumba na yongire sam tende tawa tu yongi ora ete tongba ni to son tezo tawa tu meba chagre sora rangi ngoyo trube ta da ta yebar sone tende ta de ta de 다 되니 뭔지 탈라 여버다 교황아만에 요아래 첸델레 요르 마음발에 딱바세 용그레세라 야 여버다와라 소바다 되니 치메 탈라 여버다 딱지 라와쳔게 다 라와투 투베다데 단다 요아래 교와 치말 조그레스 텐데다와데 용그 마레스 거라 치메 탈라 메버다와다 여버다와라 소바 다왕에바 탐젠 도네 세네스 도드라 렌데다세 le kiti le sabal tene nyandu da tendu likwa yobata rwa tenji debri jwa kombal ten tomba ni to ne tharwa da lamde kombal ten tharwa da te thobju yoba o tele nge ba ni do re sora tendi la yi che ba da ta me ba kombale ta me ba lam treba la kheba jura 다음에 곰네 타르바토바 간데 셰고라티 람콤줄레 케바차그레세 코아 코줄레 케바차 타르바토줄레 케바차네네 코아 교 참제파 타르바토바가 탑리아 좀 버디하고 요그레세 셰도 어디버디 질러나 야
So, here again, from understanding first the way that in terms of the thoroughly afflicted, it is this fundamental, this beginning, this first ignorance that holds to some kind of an I as being truly existent or sort of existent in and of itself from its own side, that leads then to the cycle of experiencing the various sufferings within samsara. This is an understanding of the truth of suffering and the origin of suffering, how that comes about. And then one also understands that there is no such self, independence upon our holding to there being some kind of an independent self. Again, one understands the way in which one proceeds through those links of dependent origination by way of which one experiences all of this suffering. But if one comes to an understanding of selflessness, then one has the opposite or the reverse of these links of dependent origination. So when you have then a good understanding of the kind of thoroughly afflicted side as well as the purified side, and here, beginning with the way that one views such a self, if it were the case that there were such an independent self as it is held by this fundamental ignorance, if we search for it, that self has to be findable. If we look within each of the aggregates, we have to be able to point to something that is the self, either our form or our feelings or our consciousness and so forth. There needs to be something that we can identify and say, yes, that is the independent self. Or alternatively, the self has to exist entirely apart from, separate from those aggregates. So investigating in this way, one comes to understand that it's not either any of the aggregates themselves that we can point to and say, yes, that is such an independent self. And nor is there something apart from the 5 aggregates that we can point to and say, yes, that is the self. But rather you recognize that a self is, you recognize a self that is a mere imputation, independence upon the aggregates. And that is what passes through cyclic existence. And so it is holding to there being some kind of an independent self when there really isn't such a self, that one cycles in samsara. And if you are to understand the opposite of that by meditating on selflessness, you remove the ignorance that is the cause that leads to all of the other links of dependent origination. So as opposed to So again, however, you understand that there is no permanent self that is an entity separate from the aggregates, such as the non-Buddhist assert. It's not findable there. Also, you understand that there is no self ultimately established from its own side, such as the Buddhist essentialists assert. If there were, again, we would have to be able to find it, to point it out within the 5 aggregates. So therefore, you then eliminate all wrong philosophical views, conceiving a permanent self that is an entity other than and the aggregates, or a self that is ultimately established from its own side, thinking that such a current self existed or did not exist in the past, or will exist or will not exist at some point in the future. So it's based upon this kind of reasoning that you can establish, well, there was no such independently existent self in the past. Again, it would have to be findable somehow. There won't come to be such an independently existent self, nor is there one right now. So by seeing that it doesn't exist in the way that it's not ultimately established from its own side, you then are able to understand, you then are able to create the cause, the selflessness that reverses this cycle of rebirth within samsara. So you then have conviction in karmic causality, for those things that are merely dependently designated, and dependent arising, and become skilled in traveling the path of selflessness. So based upon finding this kind of certainty and meditating on selflessness, understanding that such a self as we grasp it to doesn't actually exist, one then becomes, as it says here, skilled in the traveling the path of selflessness.
Oh yeah. That's an end to the Daria Tatama de Kundra Chireto. The Daria Saluja Bendona Sanjak de Sonto Asura. Carson Dosana. Sumba Sharibu se Sharibul Bernera. Teja Dever Joa. Some den de Yandaba Sumba Dese. Tala Soba Ra. The Tama Teja Dever Joa Rese. Teja Dever Joa Kune Yala Chuni Kwa Kursu Ra. Rawe ta yoba sonde tenje chungni kuna kwa kursu rawe ta meba tone tenje chungni chima chima done tarwa tubju te songu yara salu jambe dole soba shari bo tenje debare chungwa chum den deje yanda ba songba dise kan la la shige yanda ba shirabji yanda ba chitawa shindu shenirwa takbar meba kumbu ngala soba teta takbar meba mitabarwa 근데 소매바 라오에 다매바 그러와 다 시바네 메다바레 딱베다 요 말에 메다바레라 라오에 다요 말에 라와게 다매바레세 아니 메다바다 동해와다 동바다 동해와 사천예레지 풍부대 레다 녀모베 샤와 손자 메다바레 동해와레 동하다 다메스가 좀 남주시세요라 두제 탐제 메다바세라 쉐 탐제 동야 가서 두제 탐제 메다바 사제 탐제 동야와세 쉐 탐제 동시 다메바세 어디 가가 셰토 그래서 거라 딱반 메바 셰네 메다바 싱거데 동야와 대외 랑시체 마레 틸 동에 막보요레세 동야와 임바 싱거데 동와다스데 사제 니렌지 풍부데 다니페 ngo타데 ngo보세브나 시체 텐데 요 말에 똥바레스 뭐 타되게 똥바레스 야 사제 예레지 본부 코란 다게 뭐 매바레 공부가부터 다레데 요 마테 요 마레스 다 매바다 근데 다 가리오르스네 본부가라 때네 딱 받sam지 다요 레스 송거라 오 테네 텐데 다 매바 메다바다 동해와다 동하다 다 매바 통화 때네 네다 네베 뒤서 딱지 라와체지 달라 소바틴데 총아레다 로아 근데 가서래 데베트나 중앙 민주화 시감 다 데베트나 치르주화 시감 다 데베트나 치대부 주바 시고 신문지 탈라 교황아말이야 딱바다 직보다 라와다 텐데다요 발라 삼르땅 마레세 기나시 마호베트나 교와치말이야 딱바다 텐데 직보다 라와다 요레 팅에 다데 텐데 조르게 웨스 텐데 삼르코 마레소라 마오베트나 중앙 주람 근데 마오베트나 중앙 민주람 딱베타 뜻지로한지 달서와 마오베트나 가데진 요그래 마오베트나 치다부시 요그래는데 치메께와 치말이야 근데 여바타와 대한 종그 말레스 디버드 치로나 야
So again, there are slight differences in the order of things in this text. And so we'll be going back to the quotation from the Rice Seedling Sutra as a support for that paragraph that came below it on 137. So here it says in the Rice Seedling Sutra, Reverend Shariputra, whoever by means of perfect discriminating insight sees this dependent arising, perfectly taught by the Blessed One accordingly. So then accordingly, they see that there is no such self. Again, the Buddha has taught that there is no such permanent, unitary, autonomous kind of a self. And the Buddha has taught accordingly, therefore, things like rather than the way that we normally grasp at things as being permanent, the Buddha has taught that all phenomena are impermanent. And the way that we grasp at things as being sort of pleasurable, he has taught that really all contaminated phenomena are in the nature of suffering, and all is empty and selfless. And so here, this is then what allows these teachings of the Buddha allow one to see that there is no such self as we impute it to exist, as we normally think that it exists. So here, again, the quotation is not quoted in full in the Tibetan, but so by seeing this, that as the Buddha has realized and taught accordingly, that in reality, continuous in perpetuity without life, as in a self, free of life, just as it is, and that continues on. And so someone comes to realize then that phenomena are, particularly the self, is impermanent, suffering, empty, and selfless. And so based upon that kind of understanding that comes through the teachings of the Buddha that refute there being such a permanent, unitary, autonomous self, and one comes to recognize that there is a merely designated sort of a self, one will not have the thought, did I exist in the past or did I not exist in the past? As in a self that is somehow autonomous, permanent, unitary. They won't have the thought, oh, will I come to exist in the future? So in this way, by recognizing that all phenomena are merely designated, by seeing dependent arising as perfectly taught by the Blessed One, they won't have the kind of thought like, oh, did such a self exist in the past? Will it come to exist in the future? And so forth.
Oh yeah. 다들 너 공장도와 옆세 제ven 돌려서 산제 좀 된데다 산제 좀 된데 옆 제가 대로와 뒤도 동변도인지라 옆세 제ven 돌려 가르선도스네 개부 첨부세 옆 개불 선구여라 개부 첨부 기부 강산되네세 기부함 강사생게 되네 선구여라 come true develop ten 따요래 소래 사에 감추 감매 감롱게 감 나괴 감 남시지 감시고라 사에 감수도 류지 착보도도 루고다 착배 차도도 사에 감으래도 오라치다 베제나 전에 사시 태바 사시로 착보도도 리도도 사시고라 선 류기 루고라 서버 착배 차지 고고요다 이 사에 감세 추 감수도 차라 서버 추실라 서버 넘바 고고요다 사에 감추가 매 감수도 저 고고요다 롱게 감수도 우 주엘라 서버 고고요다 메가 롱게 감 남게 감수도 간사들에 나고다 코베나 동바코라 우파서 땅에 동바코라 부가 남과시그라테 칠로 남과트 말에 나로라 우동살라 서버 동바 매나니 도스카가 내가 제토 말와 닝다 가가 우땅고라 그래 동상들에서라 동바코라 자나시 동바시 매버든데네 우땅서라 말와 또 남게 감시 되시거라 돌레 기부 간사되네세 come to diva tezula tene takbare tezu sokbala tene takbare rawa che yo mare songo ratanda ane regbe keje tuda se mege de ka sore kibu kansa dene come to ba se kansa de come to ba se regbe keje tu se yege de regbe keje so na de regbe keje so na de regbe ta o de yogde keje tu yege nyawar kyo chobje ba de se sheson ba tar chobje la tene takbare se tezudan drene ne ta chukyo de se rawe ta chi tuye yo mare so go ra oh ne shujin ji ta ta bu se 추진다 라진세 트시기 다타보세 나라즈 소소스 다데스 소소데스와라 제제다도 사에 감라 속바 조에세 사에 감 추감 매감 롱감 남게감 다들라이 바티라 아 감시다 가셔래 감시다 내 넘버십에 감다 미그 넘버십 나 넘버십 내 넘버십 넘버십에 용구라 내 부가라 소바 부가 남게 감세 남게 감세 다 제바 감투다 세라 내 미네 얘기 깨제투 미기 깨제 나가 깨제 내 깨제 깨제 르 깨제 얘기 깨제 투제라 감투제 종이 줘서 미기 드데 르베게 초아 나가 드 르베게 초아 내 드르베 이 초아도 투 용구라 투수 접게서라 접게된 드벌 때네 용거래서라 심다 심중그 춘 디나라 심요레 심중요레 중화요라 서주 멜론 서울베 중화요레 심요레 심중요레 다속 차치 르지 차다 시베 차다 좀 드벌 때네 근데 가사스 바타게 얼마도 내가 생게 초아티도 용게 지 얼마도 라와치 계속 파샤네 라와치 다요 말해서 거라 감남 녀와르 송알라 때네 다돈 도바 이노서 대조 닥실 송네 대조 철시잖아 철시 로레 차례 시전에 대조를 때네 봐 다스 왔다고 됐다고 봤점을 다요 얼마도 라와 남중 알아서 삼반하시가 라와도 지기요나 샤도 소고 파샤 셈파샤 소파샤 대조를 때진 제일 매고네 다지 로스 요삼사 왔던데 요 말해서 그 알았던다 송알라 때네 다돈 독바 이노세 시행해봐 젠도 송시서 니 송시라 니 오만 주관에 그라 대다 사주 멜롱의 중화다 소부나 예베라 사주 멜롱의 중화 감다 셈다 셈중라 소바 대조 소바라 때네 다스 대조 강가 내가 지도네 다스 뭐제 내가 지도세 샤고르 마도 띵예바레서 예바도 감다 통보다 감다 계절라 속바 접게 대달라 때네 봐 셈다 셈중고 추트서 종에 추트서라 때네 따바samla 다샤고레스 라와 남중 아주 삼바나 생강아세 대줄레 로소 나지 요나셔 때나시와 말해서고다 추남 녀와르 송아스네 딱시 녀와르 송네스고라 철시전에 대송내네 디바다고 요라가지 지대가 다녔다데 녀와 송알라 때네 다도 도바 예노 셰게바첸도 세워라 송신스 바덴 다와타베 주발레 자세 어디바도 제일 랍샤네 주바도 제일 만도나 마운트 마타스 야
Oh. So then we have a quotation from the Meeting of the Father and Son Sutra. And this is, again, the Buddha meeting with his son, who was a king. And it says then very clearly and definitively, Great King, this person or being depends on an aggregation of the 6 elements, the 6 sense bases of contact, the 18 mental activities. So here, the 6 elements, when we think about the elements that constitute the basis of designation for a person, we have the earth, water, fire, wind, consciousness, and space. And so here, when we think about the earth element within the person, all of the sort of hard things that we have, I mean, the function of earth is to be like hard and supportive. And so the bones and the various sorts of hard things within the body, the solid things, are the earth element. Then we have the water element, the various liquid components of our body, like blood and so forth. And then there is heat in our body. So we have this fire element as well. And we have the wind, the kind of movement, the motility within our body, the breath and so forth. And then we have space. There has to be space. We're not talking about way out there, but like the empty spaces that we have in our lungs, in our airways and so forth, that allows for us to then be able to breathe. And of course, then there is consciousness. But there isn't some sort of being, person, that is somehow independent. Rather, there is a self which is dependently designated on the aggregation, the coming together of these various components. So as the commentary to this reads, Just as in this statement, the self of Dharmadatta, could be anyone, but we use the name Dharmadatta, for instance, is imputed as self, independence on its basis of imputation. So the 6 elements, which are the 4 physical elements of water, earth, air, and fire, along with the element of consciousness and the element of empty space, such as the space within the nostrils. And then we have the 6 sense bases, from the eye sense base to the mental sense base, and then the kind of objects with which they come into contact. And then the phenomena of the mind and mental processes, such as feeling created by visual contact. So here, rather than there being some kind of an independent, autonomous self that exists in and of itself, in the way that it appears to us. Now, there is something that appears to our mind, and then we mentally label it. We say, oh, that is a self. But it isn't as though that thing exists in the way that it appears to our mind. Rather, it seems that there is something that has that kind of existence. There is an appearance that arises. And then independence on that arising, on that appearance, we then say, oh, that is a self. But it's not as though the self exists in the way that it appears, but rather it is something that is merely designated on the basis of the coming together of all of these various elements that constitute the basis of designation for a person. So there's something that arises to mind, whether it's one of the aggregates or all of them together, and then we think, oh, there is a person there. But it isn't as though the person, the self, exists in the way that it initially appears to us. And this is then supported by a quotation from Chandrakirti's Entry to the Middle Way, which we'll now go to.
Oh yeah. Ini tanda tangmal shaya te kung de chira. Lovin dawadra uma juba kapso an de song shaha sigora. Dawadra uma juba le jahase. Kanchit tembe ta de soju me tamba sanje chumden de dona lia. Ta de Luigi nange saya ngobo saya kam sigora. Rubala soba tezur sigora saya sada. Kanchit tube ta de sa chu kam chala soba. Sa chu kanji tumbe taade, kanji tube taade, sachu mes de tregi chata lapsaimba, long se de utanya to zura, lunda namshi, nambar shebe kam sem kora, sem de semji kora, soa, namgwa she chos, buga namgwa, utanya ke tongba, lugi na lo tongbe cha, rosa yogora, tongsan kugyore, namgwa she chawasa, kam drutane, mikso rekwa, Saya kamla soba kam trudas. This sade chilo sal kujuya maratunda sasigora chuna chana sashi teba sai senyi sigora rugo to sai juwa tan juyora nam jungazo takbe chato kanga oh tene kasura londa namshin namgwa shechawa kanji tube ta de soju me londa namshin namgwa shechawa kamru tanes miso rekba yes rekbe kechi true style tanga chapso ten to tala ten nye ten she te zula ten ane de tare spa tagi ore se nye ten she simda simjung chu na nye so ne sokbu juwa za mai ba simda simjung ge cha de zo nye wa so ne so wa da du she de number she ba la so ba te zula ten ta girba o tiringa sokbu te bo me du se ra tirin kibu me du se ra o ga tungen du kibu me du se ra ya tiringa kibu yin se ra 소화단 두시단 때줄에 때네 파타타요라 소베 조알에 때네 타타요라 심다 심중처럼 예송네세 당신 예와라 송네세 티 처시제네 처실에 손에 로고 티티지레 다레세 데타레 발라레 메레 트시레 튼두레 센데세 타요라 예송서 예바전도 송바라 폼불에 때네 딱바sam도 예바레 Timadon Rosema Ramaveta Yoma Resetondare. Nisu teacher tene tenam dance. Tene ta dene. Tina Chobjadua because come to that kitchen chungi tachi. To Tangma Rere Neta Rebesna Mare Sera. Nisu tene Nisu teacher tene tenam da tenam Rere Neta Mare Sera. Tini Maise. Tenam rene ta mare sere. Ne tezo chokpa de ta rebesa, chok samde ta mare se. Rana kares ne teda la tene, 딱 봤으면 다 샤고래 그래. 인데서 시송 시세. 되나 다 되니 야 티버도 칠람날 담보.
So then, as again, a support for this is a quotation from Chandrakirti's Entry to the Middle Way, where he says, the sage taught that the self is dependent on the 6 elements. So the sage, the Buddha, the Bhagavan, has taught in the various sutras that the self is dependent upon the 6 elements: earth, water, fire, wind, consciousness, and space, and on the 6 supports for contact, the eye, and so on. So again, the various elements that compose our body, we have like the hard, solid things. The definition of earth is that which is solid and hard. And then we have the various kinds of like our liquid parts. We have the fire, the heat that we have within us, the wind, our breath. We have consciousness, mind, and mental factors, as well as the kind of open, empty spaces that allow for us to take breath in and out. We are dependent upon all of those kinds of elements. And so this then is, this self is designated upon, as it explains, the 6 supports for contact, the eye, and so forth. So again, we are, self is dependently designated upon the aggregation of these constituents that compose that basis of designation. So we can say things like, oh, I'm hurt, or I don't feel good. Again, in dependence upon what's happening with our body and mind, we can make statements about the I, but the I, the self, doesn't exist in the way that we hold it to. It's something that appears to mind as if it had that kind of independent, autonomous existence, but it doesn't actually exist in that way. So we can say, we could see various items appear to mind. We can identify them. Oh, that's a cow, that's an ox, that's Tashi, that's Tundrup. But when we look then at the basis of designation, try to point to what actually is that thing, there's nothing within that basis of designation, within the collection of parts that compose that we can point to and say, oh, it is that. So he taught with certainty that you apprehend the phenomena of mind and mental processes. So therefore, the self is neither them nor any one of these, either individually or collectively. So again, when we look at, well, how does the self actually exist? It appears to us, we apprehend a self that somehow seems to have this kind of independent, autonomous existence. But when we investigate, we can see that the self is something which is merely designated on the collection of these various constituents. It's not merely the collection itself, but rather it is something that is a designation on that basis. So as this ends, therefore the self is neither them nor any one of those, either individually or the collection of them.
Oh yeah, that is that.
So we
Oh, yeah,
will stop
that is.
there for today.
Again, La, thank you for your very clear explanation of dependent arising this morning. And thank you, Katrina, for your beautiful translation. We'll finish with some prayers now.
May the spiritual teachers who lead me on the sacred path, and all spiritual friends who practice it, have long life. May I pacify completely all outer and inner hindrances. Grant such inspiration, I pray. May the lives of the venerable spiritual mentors be stable, and their virtuous actions spread in the 10 directions. May the light of Lobsang's teachings dispelling the darkness of the beings in the 3 worlds always increase. Edam Guru Ratna Mandala Kam Niryatayami. Due to this merit may we soon attain the awakened state of Guru Buddha, that we may be able to liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. May the precious Bodhi mind not yet born arise and grow, May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore.
So tukje na gena.
뭐야, welcome.